The afternoon sun beat down on the dusty plains near Montgisard on November 25th, 1177. A teenage boy sat on horseback, his face hidden behind a silver mask that concealed the ravages of leprosy. King Baldwin IV of Jerusalem, just 16 years old, surveyed the impossible situation before him. His scouts had brought devastating news. Sultan Saladin was advancing toward Jerusalem with 26,000 soldiers, cavalry, infantry, and siege equipment. Against this overwhelming force, Baldwin could muster barely 500 knights, mostly Templars and Hospitallers, and a few hundred infantry. Every military calculation said to retreat behind Jerusalem's walls and prepare for siege. Instead, Baldwin made a decision that would become legend. He reached up, removed his mask, and revealed his disease-ravaged face to his men. Then he gave the order to attack. To understand this moment's significance, you need to grasp what leprosy meant in the 12th century. It was considered God's curse, divine punishment for sin. Lepers were required by law to wear bells warning of their approach, forbidden from touching healthy people, forced to live in isolated colonies away from civilization. Kings with leprosy were supposed to abdicate immediately. Yet here stood Baldwin IV, diagnosed at age 9, expected to die within years, refusing to hide, refusing to surrender, preparing to lead a cavalry charge against an army 50 times larger than his own. The Kingdom of Jerusalem in 1177 was a fragile Crusader state barely 80 years old, surrounded by Muslim powers determined to reclaim the Holy Land. Baldwin had inherited the throne at 13 when his father died, a boy king with a death sentence. His regency council had assumed he'd be a figurehead, too sick to rule effectively. They were wrong. Despite his disease progressively destroying his body, facial disfigurement, loss of fingers, eventually blindness, Baldwin possessed a brilliant military mind and absolute fearlessness, born from knowing he had nothing to lose. Saladin, 39 years old and at the height of his powers, had spent 1177 consolidating control over Egypt and Syria. He'd assembled an army of 26,000 to invade the Crusader kingdom, believing Jerusalem was vulnerable. His intelligence report said Baldwin was sick, possibly dying, with most Crusader forces scattered defending other territories. Saladin expected token resistance at best. He divided his massive army into foraging columns to feed his troops from the countryside. It was standard practice when facing weak opposition. It would prove catastrophic. Baldwin's opportunity came from Saladin's overconfidence. Crusader scouts reported the Muslim army was scattered across miles of territory, different units foraging in separate areas, command structure dispersed. Saladin himself was with only a portion of his forces. If Baldwin struck immediately, before Saladin could concentrate his army, the numerical disadvantage might not matter. 500 knights in full armor charging into scattered, unprepared light cavalry and infantry could cause chaos before numbers overwhelmed them. It was a desperate gamble, but everything was desperate for Baldwin. This story reaches you in English, the language connecting Crusader history from England to Australia, from America to New Zealand, from Canada to across the Commonwealth. I'm curious, from which corner of the English-speaking world are you watching? The Crusades shaped Western military tradition, influenced literature and culture, and their legacy echoes through centuries. That's why Baldwin's story still resonates. Courage transcending circumstance. The 500 knights Baldwin commanded were the military elite of medieval Christendom. Templars and Hospitallers, military religious orders who'd taken vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, dedicated to defending the Holy Land. These weren't ordinary soldiers. They were professional warriors who'd trained their entire adult lives in heavy cavalry warfare. Each wore 60 pounds of chainmail and plate armor, rode warhorses bred for size and strength, and fought with lance, sword, and mace. A knight in full armor was nearly unstoppable in close combat. The question was whether 500 could overcome 26,000 before being surrounded and destroyed. Baldwin gathered his knights and revealed his plan. They would attack immediately, target Saladin's dispersed forces, create chaos, and pray for miracle. But first, he needed them to follow a leper king into suicidal battle. Medieval warriors were deeply religious and superstitious. Leprosy was considered divine curse. Following a cursed king could doom them all. So Baldwin did something extraordinary. He removed his silver mask, revealing his diseased face to his army. The disfigurement was shocking, facial features partially destroyed, skin lesioned and scarred. But Baldwin met their eyes without shame and spoke words that were recorded by chroniclers. "I will not ask you to go where I will not lead." The knights knelt. They'd follow him. The true cross, Christianity's most sacred relic, supposedly containing wood from Christ's crucifixion, was brought forward. Prayers were offered. Then Baldwin, masked again, led his 500 knights towards Saladin's 26,000-strong army. What Saladin didn't know was that the masked boy king he'd underestimated was about to lead the most miraculous cavalry charge in Crusader history. On the Crusader side stood Baldwin IV, 16 years old, dying of leprosy and refusing to accept either fate. Diagnosed at age 9 when his tutor noticed the boy couldn't feel pain in his right arm, Baldwin had watched his body progressively betray him. The disease started in his extremities, loss of sensation in hands and feet, then visible lesions, then facial disfigurement. By 16, his face was partially destroyed, requiring the silver mask he wore in public. Medieval medicine offered no cure, no hope, only inevitable deterioration until death. Most boys would have surrendered to despair. Baldwin studied military tactics, learned to fight one-handed as leprosy claimed his right arm, and prepared to be the king his kingdom needed. The mask Baldwin wore wasn't just practical, it was psychological warfare turned inward. In medieval society, physical appearance reflected spiritual state. Beautiful faces suggested God's favor, ugly faces suggested sin. A leper's face was considered evidence of divine punishment. By wearing the mask, Baldwin could function in court, meet with nobles, issue commands without his diseased face undermining his authority. But that mask also isolated him, marked him as different, reminded everyone, including himself, that he was cursed. Removing that mask before battle was a profound act, showing his men the face he normally hid, refusing to lead from behind symbol of shame. Despite his disease, Baldwin possessed qualities that made him extraordinary leader. He was highly intelligent, speaking multiple languages, understanding complex military strategy. He was fearless in combat, leading charges personally when other kings commanded from rear. Most importantly, he inspired absolute loyalty. Knights who should have been disgusted by his leprosy instead followed him into impossible battles. There's something compelling about a leader who knows he's dying and chooses to die gloriously rather than waste away. Baldwin's very presence said, "If a dying leper king won't surrender, what excuse do healthy warriors have?" Facing Baldwin was Saladin, Salah ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub, 39 years old and the most formidable Muslim commander since the Crusades began. Born in Tikrit, trained in military service under his uncle, risen to Sultan of Egypt and Syria, Saladin had spent years uniting fractious Muslim kingdoms to present united front against Crusaders. He was a brilliant strategist, charismatic leader, and genuinely pious Muslim who saw reconquering Jerusalem as religious duty. His reputation for chivalry and mercy was renowned even among Crusaders. But in November 1177, his greatest weakness was showing: overconfidence. Saladin commanded approximately 26,000 soldiers assembled from Egypt and Syria. His core strength was light cavalry, fast mobile horse archers who could harass, retreat, and wear down enemies from distance. He had thousands of infantry, both regular soldiers and volunteer religious warriors. He had siege equipment for attacking Jerusalem's walls. Most importantly, he had overwhelming numerical superiority and knew it. His intelligence suggested Baldwin was sick, possibly dying, with Jerusalem defended by skeleton force. Saladin expected this campaign to be glorified raid, not serious battle. If this story of the teenage leper king who refused to surrender, who removed his mask and charged an army 50 times larger than his own, is inspiring you right now, you need to subscribe to Unfinished Battles and hit that like button. Because what happens in the next few hours at Montgisard isn't just military history. It's a lesson about courage transcending circumstance. This is a story about refusing to accept defeat even when your body is dying and your enemy seems invincible. Stay with us for this. The forces facing each other were dramatically mismatched. Baldwin's 500 knights were elite heavy cavalry, but 500 against 26,000 was suicide by any military calculation. However, those 500 represented the pinnacle of medieval military technology. A knight in full armor on a warhorse was medieval equivalent of a tank, nearly invincible in close combat, capable of smashing through infantry lines, devastating psychological weapon. The Templars and Hospitallers weren't just soldiers, they were religious zealots who believed dying for the Holy Land guaranteed paradise. They wouldn't break, wouldn't retreat, wouldn't surrender. The strategic context made Montgisard crucial. If Saladin reached Jerusalem, the city would fall. The Crusader kingdom's survival depended on stopping him before he besieged the capital. But Baldwin couldn't simply defend Jerusalem's walls and wait. Saladin could besiege the city while simultaneously raiding the countryside, destroying Crusader power gradually. Baldwin needed decisive victory, needed to shatter Saladin's army so completely that he'd retreat to Egypt. With 500 knights against 26,000, that seemed impossible, unless Saladin made mistake. And Saladin was making mistake. His army was scattered across miles, different units foraging separately to feed themselves from the countryside. This was standard practice when facing weak opposition. No point keeping army concentrated and hungry when enemy couldn't threaten you anyway. But it meant Saladin's 26,000 weren't concentrated mass. They were dispersed groups separated by distance. If attacked suddenly, they couldn't support each other. If panicked, they couldn't rally effectively. Saladin's overwhelming advantage existed only if his forces could concentrate. Baldwin's plan was to prevent that. As afternoon wore on toward evening on November 25th, Baldwin and his 500 knights prepared for the charge. They'd prayed before the true cross. They'd seen their king remove his mask and reveal his diseased face. They knew the odds. They knew most of them would die. But they also knew they were fighting for Jerusalem, for their faith, for their leper king who refused to hide. Saladin, miles away, had no idea that the boy king he'd dismissed was about to attack. Late afternoon on November 25th brought the moment of decision. Baldwin's scouts returned with crucial intelligence. Saladin's army was scattered across several miles, different units foraging in separate areas, the Sultan himself with only a portion of his forces near the town of Tel Giza. The Muslim army wasn't concentrated mass ready for battle. They were dispersed groups thinking themselves safe from weak enemy. Baldwin saw his opportunity. If he attacked immediately, before Saladin could gather his scattered forces, 500 heavy cavalry might accomplish what 5,000 couldn't in normal battle. It was now or never. Baldwin gave the order. 500 knights formed up in disciplined ranks, the true cross relic carried at the front by the Bishop of Bethlehem. These weren't chaotic medieval charges depicted in movies, they were precisely organized military formations. Knights arranged in wedge shapes designed to punch through enemy lines, each man knowing his position, his role, his duty. Templars in their white surcoats with red crosses, Hospitallers in black with white crosses, secular knights in their family colors, all united under Baldwin's command. The boy king, masked again after his revelation, rode at the front where kings were supposed to be. The prayer before the charge was recorded by chroniclers. Baldwin and his knights knelt, asking God's blessing for the impossible task ahead. They prayed to St. George, patron of soldiers. They prayed before the true cross, Christianity's most sacred relic. Medieval warriors were deeply religious, believing divine intervention determined battles. They needed to believe God was with them, because military logic certainly wasn't. 500 against 26,000 required miracle. So they prayed for one, then mounted their war horses and prepared to charge. The initial approach was crucial. Baldwin needed to reach Saladin's forces before they could organize defense. Heavy cavalry's advantage was shock impact, the devastating moment when armored knights on armored horses crashed into enemy formations at full gallop. But that advantage disappeared if enemy had time to form proper defensive positions with spears and archers. So Baldwin's knights approached at steady trot, preserving horses' energy, staying in formation, waiting until they were close enough that acceleration to full charge would hit before defenders could prepare. Saladin's forces, scattered and foraging, had no warning. The first Muslim soldiers to see the Crusader charge probably didn't believe it. Enemy army they'd been told was weak and cowering was attacking. Impossible. Must be small raiding party. By the time they realized that this was the entire Crusader field army committed to attack, it was too late. Knights in full armor on warhorses weigh over a ton combined. At full gallop, they're unstoppable. The first Muslim cavalry unit to receive the charge simply disintegrated. The impact was catastrophic. Crusader lances, 12-foot weapons designed for shock combat, punched through light cavalry armor like paper. Muslim horses, smaller and lighter than European warhorses, were bowled over by the charge's sheer mass. Knights who'd broken lances drew swords and maces, cutting down anyone within reach. The key was maintaining momentum. If cavalry stopped moving in enemy midst, they could be surrounded and pulled down. So Templar sergeants screamed at knights to keep moving, keep killing, drive deeper into enemy positions. Saladin's light cavalry, excellent for harassment and archery, was helpless against heavy cavalry charge. Their tactics required distance and mobility. They'd shoot arrows, retreat, shoot again, wearing enemies down. But Crusader knights closed distance before those tactics could work. In close combat, armored knight with lance and sword massacred lightly armored horse archer with bow. The disparity was shocking. Medieval chroniclers described knights cutting through 5 or 6 Muslims each in the initial charge before their weapons even broke. The psychological impact exceeded physical casualties. Muslim soldiers throughout the scattered army heard sounds of combat, saw dust clouds, received garbled reports of Crusader attack. Panic spread faster than facts. How many Crusaders were attacking? Thousands? The entire kingdom's army? In chaos and confusion, Saladin's numerical advantage meant nothing because those numbers couldn't coordinate. Units that could have rallied instead fled, fearing they'd be cut off and destroyed individually. By the time Saladin received word of attack, the situation was already chaos. Different commanders sent contradictory reports. Some units were fighting, some retreating, some had no idea what was happening. Saladin tried to rally his bodyguard and counterattack, but he couldn't locate most of his army in the confusion. Medieval communication was line of sight and messenger-based. Once battle became chaotic, coordinating 26,000 scattered troops was nearly impossible. Baldwin and his 500 knights drove deeper into Muslim forces, the true cross relic marking their position. Chronicles describe the cross appearing to shine with divine light, visible across the battlefield. Whether literal miracle or sun reflecting off metal, the symbol rallied Crusaders and terrified Muslims. They weren't just fighting Baldwin's army, they were fighting God's wrath. Medieval battles were as much psychological as physical. Once soldiers believed they were losing, they fled. Saladin's army was beginning to believe exactly that. What began as coordinated charge became pursuit of panicking army. Saladin's scattered forces, unable to concentrate, started breaking and fleeing individually. Units that hadn't even been engaged heard rumors of massive Crusader attack and ran without fighting. The psychological collapse was total. Muslim soldiers who'd marched confidently toward Jerusalem that morning were now fleeing desperately toward Egypt, abandoning equipment, horses, and wounded comrades. The 26,000-strong army that was supposed to conquer the Crusader kingdom was disintegrating into terrified mob. Saladin himself was in mortal danger. With only his personal bodyguard and a few hundred loyal troops, he found himself surrounded by fleeing soldiers and pursuing Crusaders. Baldwin's knights were cutting through scattered Muslim forces hunting for the Sultan. If Saladin was killed or captured, the war would effectively end. Muslim unity would collapse without his leadership. Everything Saladin had built, the alliance between Egypt and Syria, the coalition against the Crusaders, depended on his survival. And that survival was suddenly very much in question. The pursuit was relentless. Medieval cavalry doctrine said that most battle casualties occurred during pursuit, not during the fight itself. Once an army broke and ran, cavalry could ride down fleeing soldiers who couldn't defend themselves. Templars and Hospitallers, motivated by religious fervor and the thrill of impossible victory, chased scattered Muslim forces for miles. Each knight's warhorse could run down lighter Muslim cavalry horses. Each armored crusader was invulnerable to panicked soldiers' desperate attacks. The killing went on for hours. Chronicles describe scenes of apocalyptic slaughter. Muslim soldiers throwing away weapons to run faster. Cavalry trampling infantry who couldn't keep pace. Men drowning, trying to cross streams in panicked retreat. Units that tried to rally being scattered by renewed crusader charges. The flat plains around Montgisard, which should have been perfect terrain for Saladin's numerical advantage, became killing ground where crusader heavy cavalry hunted scattered enemies with impunity. Saladin's escape was narrow and humiliating. His bodyguard fought desperately to buy him time, many dying to protect their sultan. Saladin was forced to abandon his warhorse and mount a racing camel, faster for long-distance escape, but deeply humiliating for a warrior of his status. The sultan who'd ridden into the kingdom of Jerusalem expecting easy conquest was now fleeing for his life on a camel, his army destroyed around him. Chronicles say he reached Egypt with only a fraction of his forces, exhausted and traumatized. The casualty figures were staggering and disputed, but all sources agree they were catastrophic for Saladin. Contemporary estimates claimed 20,000 to 23,000 Muslim casualties, killed, captured, or scattered. Modern historians think these numbers inflated, but agree losses exceeded 15,000. Crusader casualties were minimal, perhaps a few dozen killed and 100 wounded. The disparity reflected the one-sided nature of the battle. Armored cavalry massacring fleeing light infantry, and cavalry who couldn't effectively fight back. The battlefield after Montgisard was carpeted with Muslim dead. Crusader soldiers spent the following days looting bodies, collecting weapons and armor, and gathering prisoners. The amount of captured equipment was so vast, it took weeks to transport to Jerusalem. Saladin's siege equipment, supply train, and treasure chest were all captured. The invasion force that was supposed to conquer Jerusalem had itself been conquered. By nightfall on November 25th, Baldwin and his 500 knights returned to Jerusalem as heroes. The boy king who'd removed his mask and led suicidal charge had destroyed an army 50 times larger than his own. The dying leper who should have been hiding in palace had saved the kingdom. Priests proclaimed it miracle, divine intervention proving God favored the Crusaders. Soldiers who'd charged with Baldwin knew they'd witnessed something extraordinary, military victory that defied all logic and probability. The True Cross relic was returned to Jerusalem in triumph. Medieval Crusaders attributed the victory to the cross's presence, believing it had channeled divine power into their charge. Whether literal miracle or simply the psychological boost of fighting under Christianity's most sacred symbol, the True Cross became central to Montgisard's legend. The relic that had led the charge would be carried into battles for decades, until its capture by Saladin at Hattin in 1187. For Saladin, Montgisard was crushing defeat that would haunt him. He'd underestimated the Crusaders, divided his forces carelessly, and nearly died fleeing from a teenage leper. His reputation for invincibility was shattered. His army was destroyed. His invasion was defeated. It would take him years to rebuild the military strength he'd lost in those 3 hours. The Sultan who'd expected easy conquest had learned that the Crusader kingdom, led by a dying boy king, still had fight left. The immediate aftermath of Montgisard was the Crusader kingdom's salvation. Saladin's invasion was shattered, his army destroyed, his reputation damaged. Jerusalem, which had been hours away from siege, was safe. The kingdom of Jerusalem, which had seemed on the verge of collapse, had won a reprieve. And at the center of this miracle stood Baldwin IV, the teenage leper king who'd removed his mask and led 500 knights to victory against 26,000. His legend was born that day on the plains of Montgisard, and it would endure long after his diseased body finally failed. Baldwin's personal triumph was bittersweet. He'd saved his kingdom, but his body continued its inevitable deterioration. Leprosy is progressive and incurable. After Montgisard, Baldwin lived 8 more years, each year bringing more suffering. His hands became claws as tendons contracted. His facial features continued eroding. He lost his sight. By his early 20s, he could no longer ride horses or hold weapons. The warrior king who'd led cavalry charges was reduced to being carried on a litter, his commands given through intermediaries, his face hidden behind the mask permanently. Yet Baldwin continued ruling with the same courage he'd shown at Montgisard. Unable to fight physically, he fought politically and strategically. He managed the fractious Crusader nobility, negotiated with Byzantium, organized kingdom defenses, and planned military campaigns he could no longer lead personally. He appointed competent commanders and trusted them to execute his strategies. Until his death in 1185 at age 24, Baldwin remained the mind behind Crusader resistance even as his body became prison. Montgisard bought the Crusader kingdom approximately 10 years. Saladin needed that decade to rebuild his shattered army, consolidate power in Egypt and Syria, and prepare for another invasion attempt. Those 10 years allowed the Kingdom of Jerusalem to fortify defenses, negotiate alliances, and prepare for the inevitable return of Muslim forces. Without Montgisard's reprieve, the kingdom might have fallen in 1177. Instead, it survived until 1187. When Saladin finally returned with a rebuilt army, Baldwin was 2 years dead. The Battle of Hattin in July 1187 was Montgisard's reverse. Saladin destroyed the Crusader field army and captured Jerusalem 3 months later. The true cross relic that had led Baldwin's charge at Montgisard was captured at Hattin, never to be recovered. The Crusader kingdom that Baldwin had saved lasted barely 2 years after his death. Without the leper king's leadership, the kingdom's internal conflicts and weak succession doomed it. Montgisard's tactical lessons remain relevant. Heavy cavalry's shock value, the importance of attacking overconfident enemies, the psychological impact of unexpected aggression, the vulnerability of dispersed forces, all these principles are still taught in military academies. Baldwin's decision to attack with 500 against 26,000 seems suicidal until you understand he attacked scattered forces, not concentrated army. Modern special operations doctrine teaches similar principles. Small elite forces attacking at decisive moment can achieve what large armies cannot. The religious interpretations vary by perspective. Christian chroniclers called Montgisard a miracle, divine intervention proving God's favor. Muslim chroniclers blamed Saladin's overconfidence and poor reconnaissance. Modern historians note that Baldwin made brilliant tactical decision exploiting enemy mistake. All three interpretations contain truth. Whether divine miracle, military genius, or combination of both, the result was one of history's most improbable victories. The cultural impact extended beyond military history. Baldwin IV became legendary figure representing courage, transcending physical limitation. A dying teenager who refused to surrender, who led from the front despite disease that should have hidden him away, who saved kingdom through sheer willpower and tactical brilliance. His story inspired medieval literature, modern films, and countless retellings. The image of the masked leper king removing his mask before battle became symbol of courage revealing itself. For Saladin, Montgisard was lesson in humility. He never again underestimated Crusader forces. His later campaigns were characterized by careful preparation, proper reconnaissance, and respect for enemy capabilities. The defeat that humiliated him made him better commander. When he finally conquered Jerusalem in 1187, it was through methodical siege after destroying Crusader army in proper battle, not through overconfident invasion. The broader significance of Montgisard was proving the Crusader kingdom could still defend itself. After decades of Muslim victories and Crusader decline, Baldwin's triumph demonstrated that with proper leadership and tactics, the outnumbered Crusaders remained formidable. That demonstration bought time, maintained morale, and ensured the Crusader presence in the Holy Land continued for another century beyond Baldwin's death. If this story of the teenage leper king who removed his mask and charged an army 50 times his size, who refused to accept defeat even as disease destroyed his body, has moved you, then subscribe to Unfinished Battles right now, hit that like button, and comment telling me which country you're watching from and which stories of courage against impossible odds resonate with your nation's history. Every culture has its heroes who refuse to surrender. Share yours with us. At Montgisard, a 16-year-old dying of leprosy removed his mask and led 500 knights against 26,000 enemies. In 3 hours, he destroyed an empire's army and became legend. Sometimes courage isn't about being strong or healthy or having advantages. Sometimes courage is about refusing to surrender even when your body is dying, when the odds are impossible, when every rational voice says, "Give up." Baldwin IV never surrendered, and that made all the difference.